So now let's start looking at some of the causal factors in addiction, specifically how are genes involved. So it turns out that there are two types of alcoholism that correspond to underlying genetic differences. Type 1 involves a cautious and emotionally dependent type of personality. So this person is not particularly impulsive at all. They typically began drinking after the age of 25, and they might experience periods of abstinence mixed with binge drinking. Type 2 describes a person who is more impulsive, uninhibited, confident, socially detached, more likely to be male than female, and this type is associated with fighting, reckless driving, that sort of thing. So really two different types of profiles, and yet both involving excessive drinking. There are studies that have looked at how heritable alcoholism is, and it is quite heritable. So for alcoholism, the heritability is estimated at 50 to 60%, and we can compare that to hallucinogens as well as cocaine use also having pretty high heritability. So there are certainly genetic factors in alcoholism. So let's take a look at, how this might work. People who do not respond to the negative effects of alcohol as well, in other words, when they drink, they don't experience some of those negative consequences as much, such as like the motor impairment that might happen, or any negative, physiological feelings or emotional feelings. Well, they're 4 times more likely to become alcoholic later. The inheritable ability to eliminate aldehyde during the process of digestion of alcohol is associated with alcoholism, and is also vulnerability to other drugs. So the better a person is able to break down alcohol, the higher the risk for alcoholism. And a genetic deficiency in the ability to metabolize nicotine actually protects some people from nicotine addiction as well. So in a sense, people who can sort of, we could talk about people handling alcohol, they are at higher risk of developing alcoholism. A number of genes are common to drug dependence and the personality characteristics associated with it, like impulsivity, risk-taking, novelty seeking, and stress responsiveness. Genes involved in alcohol addiction also alter brain activity. So alcoholics and their offspring show a reduction in what's normally seen as a dip in a brain evoked potential. So let's take a look over here on the right of this picture. And so here at time 0, imagine there's a sudden stimulus. It could be just a light that's shown or a sudden sound. And what we see is that in a typical individual, shown here in this sort of lighter colored orange line, there's this dip that happens about 300 milliseconds after the stimulus. And that dip is much more reduced in high-risk children, the offspring of people who are alcoholic. And so it does seem that some of these differences are showing up in just the brain's reaction to stimuli. These EEG abnormalities, though, are not specific to alcoholism. They often occur in disorders characterized by behavioral disinhibition, such as conduct disorder, antisocial behavior, and other types of drug abuse as well. So it is not a gene for alcohol or a set of genes for alcohol consumption or alcoholism. It is a number of different traits that are more likely in these individuals. So it's not specifically to drink alcohol. It's a number of different traits. Addiction research has very broad implications for understanding vulnerability and behavioral inheritance. Remember our gene and environment interactions. Can you think of an example of how environment might influence addiction? So think about home environment, cultural messages about alcohol use, the availability of alcohol and other drugs at an early age. think of those kinds of things and how those environmental factors could be important. Then you can also add into that things like stressful environments, anxiety producing environments, and the issue that, especially with alcohol and some other drugs, that they could be ways of coping with stress and anxiety. So we can really see how these gene and environment interactions are really important here, and we can't just say that it's just genes or just environment, but typically we can point to genes as making a person more vulnerable than to those environmental influences. Here's a short video that summarizes some of the genetic factors involved in alcoholism.
Looking at these family photos, you wouldn't know that addiction nearly destroyed Amy Shields Olsen's world.
I was writing suicide notes to my children. I would have blackouts where I wouldn't remember if I'd fed them dinner.
Amy became an alcoholic largely because she couldn't escape her genes. Dr. Marvin Sepelis says genetics is the #1 risk factor for addiction.
Over 50% of the likelihood that a person's going to end up with addiction has to do with their genetic history.
If your mom or dad is an alcoholic, your risk skyrockets.
At least 6 times more likely than the general population.
Then there's age. Studies show people who start drinking before 15 are 5 times more likely to become addicted than those who begin drinking after they turn 21. Another risk factor, tolerance, especially when people first use alcohol.
It's the people that really can tolerate the alcohol that have the genetic predisposition and end up at higher risk.
There are also protective genes that exist mostly in Japanese, Chinese, and Korean people who get flushed when they drink.
And that actually will prevent alcohol use because they just don't like how it feels.
Amy is now an addiction counselor. She hopes to pass down the knowledge she's learned to her kids, giving them the power to break the cycle.
Everything I have in life today is as a result of making the decision to say I do need help.
I'm Andrew McIntosh reporting.
This morning.